It's a key region geopolitically for both China and the United States. We'll discuss what's at stake in Southeast Asia. Hello, I'm Arnold Naidu, and this is The Heat. Just last month, Chinese State Councilor and Foreign Minister Wang hosted foreign ministers from the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, known as ASEAN, with a face-to-face meeting in Chongqing. The Chinese Foreign Minister pledged further vaccine assistance to the 10 countries battling the coronavirus pandemic. China is working to improve ties in the region, while the United States is hoping to restore its credibility after 4 years of the Trump administration. Both countries are engaged in geopolitical competition in the region. To discuss this, let's bring in our panel. Joining us from Washington, D.C. is Sourabh Gupta. He is a resident senior fellow with the Institute for China-America Studies. James P. Moore, Jr. is the founder and CEO of the Washington Institute for Business, Government and Society here in Washington, D.C. From Manila, Richard Heydarian is a professorial chairholder in geopolitics at the Polytechnic University of the Philippines, and Einar Tangen is a political and economic affairs commentator based in Beijing. Thank you, everyone, for being with us. And Einar, let me start with you. The United States sees China as a competitor. President Biden has said that on many occasions. These two countries, they do cooperate on certain issues, but the United States is quick to point out the differences, and many differences there are between the two countries. And these differences, of course, extend to competition for influence in Southeast Asia. How do you see this competition playing out right now?
Well, right now, China has the upper hand because they've been reaching out. COVID-19 is a huge issue in Southeast Asia, and it's been largely ignored by the U.S. as it's been preoccupied with internal divisions and also trying to get its own people vaccinated. Also, with Donald Trump having skipped the last 3 years of ASEAN, there's a sense that the U.S. is not that interested. There is going to be more interest, however, as the U.S. tries to counter China, because ASEAN has now become the #1 trade partner. Things are growing very quickly there, so you can expect a kind of a chess move by Biden to do something. It's just not clear what it is. He still hasn't. There are 4 nations, ASEAN nations, that don't even have U.S. ambassadors as of now.
Einar, there have been some concerns expressed by commentators and analysts that this rivalry could escalate to a kind of Cold War along the lines that we saw between the United States and the Soviet Union. What do you think? Is that possible?
Well, I think you see it particularly in the areas of high tech, but you're also seeing a much broader front extending into the financial areas as the U.S. is trying to tamp down China's growth. Now, places like ASEAN are in the middle. They do not want confrontation. They prefer consensus. In 1971, they expressed that they do not want to be choosing sides, and they certainly do not want powers trying to exercise dominion over their countries. That's why they came together. So they're trying to figure out what the third way is, how they can economically cooperate with a growing China and keep the U.S. somewhat, in between, not forcing them to choose sides.
James Moore, the United States clearly wants to solidify and expand its influence in Southeast Asia. Back during the Obama administration, President Obama announced what became known as the pivot to Asia. It was also referred to as rebalancing, because the United States would move more of its military hardware into that area, the Indo-Pacific area. What right now, James, are the United States' goals in Southeast Asia?
Well, first of all, I think it's important to realize that we now have a president of the United States who has had more experience in the area of foreign relations than any president we've ever elected. The notion that he was vice president for 8 years and for 12 years was the chairman or the ranking minority member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee is just touching the surface. I think he is very much preoccupied with what is going to happen in Asia. One of the reasons that we're getting out of the longest war that America has ever been involved with, namely Afghanistan, is because there is a desire to be able to focus on Asia. And so I think that One of the things we're going to see is a complete, a new approach, for example, to the military. We're not going to see the kind of money that was put into the Army that we've seen in the past, and then we're going to see that the Air Force and that the Navy are going to be receiving more resources from the U.S. government. And that is all part of trying to focus on Asia. As far as Southeast Asia is concerned, I think it's important to recognize that although there has been more preoccupation with other parts of the world, that's been with the intention of being able to focus on that part of the world. The very first head of state to be able to visit the president was Prime Minister Suga of Japan. And most recently, we saw South Korea's President Moon visit. And on more than one occasion, after meeting with President Biden, he made it abundantly clear that America's back in center stage.
James, the thing is that not everybody agrees that the United States is focused on building its relationships in Southeast Asia. There was an article in Foreign Policy magazine which was very critical of the Biden administration. It said that the Biden team, according to this article, is confused and risks losing the region. It pointed to the lack of a comprehensive economic agenda for the region. And as Einar Tangen told us a moment ago, it's been dragging its feet on key diplomatic postings. And the fact that President Biden has not really called many of the Southeast Asian leaders so far since coming to office.
Well, I think it's important to recognize that, first of all, he's been in office for 6 months. There is a deep bench, quite frankly, in some of the people that he's brought in, including Anthony Blinken, the Secretary of State, who do have Asia experience. And so I would argue that it's a matter of time that we'll find greater emphasis on Asia. But that doesn't take away from the fact that his eye is on that ball, and I think time will tell.
Sourabh Gupta, we're also seeing a familiar pattern in this sort of power rivalry between the United States and China, where Southeast Asian leaders have been complaining that they're being forced to choose sides right now, choose the United States or choose China. And, you know, can ASEAN, which, as Einar pointed out, is a very important grouping, a trade grouping in Southeast Asia, can it survive given the strains of these two sides pulling on them for their allegiance?
Yes, I think it can survive. I think ASEAN underestimates itself. And I think most people underestimate ASEAN to the extent to which it can be a decisive balancing power, frankly, in the geopolitics of the Indo-Pacific region. You are absolutely correct with regard to the Asian leaders, Southeast Asian leaders not wanting to choose. You know, fundamentally for them, the most important priority is development. These are all developing countries which still have many years, some still decades, to get to being an advanced country. And so while there are territorial issues which need to be dealt with in, say, the South China Sea, their fundamental overriding interest and priority is development. And to the extent that development has been set back by COVID only makes getting to that point of development and public health that much more important. And it's frankly disappointing that, you know, it's the US and China which have been able to put vaccines on the table, effective vaccines, also the Russians, et cetera, and yet this is a cross-cutting issue. It's not an issue where there's an advantage to one party or advantage to another party. Global public health is like climate change. Everybody wins from that. But it's disappointing to see that the US and China could not be on the same page in kind of pooling their vaccines in a big way and reaching out to Southeast Asia and other countries. And I think Southeast Asian leaders will see this from the perspective of disappointment, frankly.
And if you look at China and the United States, Sourabh, if there is no change in the relationship, if it doesn't improve dramatically, you know, it's a question I put to Einar earlier on, do you sort of see this evolve into some type of Cold War?
A Cold War in the area of high technology and advanced manufacturing. A Cold War in terms of geostrategic competition, perhaps just the early stirrings of it, but that is something which will need to be measured in decades. So I don't really see it in that sort of a Cold War narrative, but I do see that there is a real concerted effort, even by the Biden administration, to decouple economically from China in some regards, as well as work through kind of small groups in terms of trying to build pressure against China. And that itself is an issue which is sort of dividing and I would say even angering ASEAN, because countries like Indonesia don't want to have to necessarily choose. They don't want everybody beseeching them to be part of the Quad or lean in that direction. They just want everybody to prosper, because at the end of the day, it's about development first and prosperity rather than Cold War mongering and fighting, frankly.
Right, let's go to Richard Hedarian in the Philippines. And Richard, great to have you with us again. Let's look at the Philippines as a case in point. It's a large country, an influential country, a populous nation in Southeast Asia. In 2016, President Duterte announced a separation from the United States. He wanted to move closer to China. How would you characterize the relationship between China and the Philippines right now?
Well, as far as the Philippines' foreign policy is concerned, there was definitely a rupture under President Duterte. I think he really wanted to make sure that he sends the right signal, and his signal was that the Philippines will not automatically stand by the United States when it comes to its emerging competition with China, and that he is interested in compartmentalizing the Philippines' relations with China in ways that it will allow the country to develop robust infrastructure development and trade relations with China, without at the same time, of course, completely ignoring the disputes in the South China Sea. That was the modus operandi of President Duterte when he came to power in 2016. But over the past 5 years, a lot of problems have risen. One of them is that domestically among the Philippines defense establishment, many people do not share President Duterte's views. They believe that China is a strategic threat to the Philippines and that the U.S. is an ally that is increasingly reliable, given the fact that under Trump and Biden, we see a much more robust pushback against China in the South China Sea. As far as public opinion is concerned, it's more broadly skeptical of China than the president himself. As far as promises of Chinese investments are concerned, a lot of them have been delayed or canceled. So that has made it quite difficult for President Duterte to pivot to China, so to speak, as he was signaling in 2016. But at the same time, President Duterte has also made it clear that he doesn't want the Philippines to be kind of a forward deployment base for the Americans. And we have seen the Philippines consistently dragging its foot on the full implementation of the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement signed in 2014, just 2 years before Duterte came into power. And that agreement was supposed to give Americans rotational access and ability to preposition weapons in key bases close to the disputed areas in the South China Sea, in Palawan, Bautista Air Base, in Basa Air Base, close to Scarborough. And of course, interestingly, we see since last year a lot of uncertainty over the Visiting Forces Agreement, with President Duterte constantly suspending the abrogation of the agreement. But the future of that is very much in the air. So I think here we see some structural problems whereby, Biden wants to talk about democracy. He wants to talk about rallying allies against China. And then you have treaty allies like the Philippines, century allied like the Philippines, ruled by more authoritarian populist leaders who do not share ideologically with Biden a vision of democracy and human rights. But more importantly, they do not share Biden's view that China is a kind of threat that has to be pushed back against.
Einar Tangen, of course, there is competition between China and the United States, as you pointed out, on technology development, on trade issues. But there's also geopolitical strategic competition, isn't there? The United States, or China rather, is challenged constantly by the United States military in the South China Sea. The 7th Fleet has been sailing through the South China Sea. There have been reconnaissance flights that have been carried out from those ships. I mean, it's not new. This is something that happened under President Trump as well. But to what extent does this contribute to heightening tensions in the region?
Well, it's very deliberate. I mean, I think Beijing sees it that way, that they're trying to escalate and push this into some sort of confrontation. Remember, the more ships you have there, the U.S. has 400 bases surrounding the area, the more chances you have that there will be an incident, an escalation, something that goes bad. This would be good for the U.S. in terms of PR. But, China's kind of walking on eggshells. They don't want to be, constrained in their own backyard. But, this is one of the odd things. You hear about Freedom of Navigation Act, but, quite frankly, China gets 80% of its oil from, these areas. If they shut down the waterways, not only would they lose the oil, they would also lose their ability to ship out the 40% of their total exports that go through that area. So no one has yet explained exactly why China would threaten itself for no particular reason, and why these Freedom of Navigation Acts are essential.
Richard, I just want to get back to you on the point that we're talking about this kind of strategic rivalry that we see in the region. The United States State Department has just approved the potential sale of fighter jets to the Philippines. These are U.S. Lockheed Martin F-16 fighter jets. The deal is worth about $2.5 billion. I mean, explain this acquisition to us and the impact it would have in the region.
Well, this has been long in the making. I mean, back in 1996, 1997, the Philippines was actually moving towards acquiring F-18 fighters from the Americans. But because of the Asian financial crisis and fiscal issues back in the Philippines, and of course, American skepticism that the Filipinos will be capable to properly maintain this kind of cutting-edge technology, it didn't push through. But again, in the past 20 years, this topic has come up over and over again. And President Duterte, a lot of people, including myself, we have been very critical of the alliance with the United States in the sense that we feel that the Philippines is not getting a good deal out of this alliance compared to other allies, or even non-allies from Pakistan to Jordan or Egypt. I mean, these are countries who have been getting billions of dollars in aid from the United States throughout the years. And if America believes that China is indeed a major threat to the Philippines, how come, the kind of aid that the Philippines is getting or the kind of military equipment it's getting is definitely not at par? I mean, we're talking about mostly Vietnam-era weaponries, among others, right, as far as major hardware is concerned. So I think this is more a corrective to that, not to mention that the Philippines, well, similar to the United States, but on a far more humble scale, is also trying to move away from army-based military doctrine after half a century of insurgency and move towards developing its naval and air force capability. And that's why since 2011, the Philippines has launched its newest military modernization act, allocating billions of dollars. It's three-phased. So the first phase already finished 3 years ago. Now we're in the second phase of that, and part of that is developing the Philippines Air Force capability. And then the next phase will be acquisition of submarines and other advanced frigates and warships. So the Philippines is trying to correct decades of neglect, and also I think the United States is also trying to send a signal to the Philippines that it is willing to really advance the Philippines' capabilities to be able to stand on its own.
James Moe, what is your view on this? Are these complaints from the Philippines, are they justified that they've been neglected to a large extent by the United States? But we also have this arms deal right now. What does that tell us?
I think it's important to realize that there really is a new dawn that has arrived in regards to the relationship between the United States, the Philippines, and quite frankly, Asia. We have just had 4 years of America First with President Trump. And now we have President Biden, who has walked in the door, and he's made it clear that he does not want to confront China in such a way that the neighbors of China are going to have to pick sides. I mean, that has been made abundantly clear because he realizes what a difficult situation it is. But indeed, there is no question that the foundation is being laid for a very different kind of relationship between the United States and China. And all you have to do is turn to President Xi's recent remarks on the 100th anniversary of communism to realize that the lion is roaring in that part of the world, and the United States is certainly going to have to take note and figure out exactly how to be able to address that. But again, I think it's important to realize that the jury is out in trying to determine exactly what the United States is going to do, and in fact what China is going to do into the future.
Sourabh Gupta, the United States sees the Philippines as a close partner. In fact, one Asian expert warned that if the United States loses the Philippines, it loses the South China Sea. How critical is the alliance?
Oh, I think the alliance is important, in fact, very important. But I will throw in a little bit of a twister out here. And I will say that actually the reason Philippines is so important is actually not because of the South China Sea, but in fact because of a Taiwan scenario. And I would even place the South China Sea well beneath a Taiwan scenario, a Taiwan contingency. Remember, the two things that get the U.S. really acting and active militarily is if navigation is being denied, or if there is an implicit or explicit defense guarantee. Now, in the South China Sea, we hear about freedom of navigation. that is really not to do with navigation per se. It has to do with excessive claims. That's a legal issue. It's not navigation which is being denied, as was also explained. And with regard to defense guarantees, yeah, Taiwan doesn't have an explicit guarantee, but there is a sort of an implicit guarantee. And in the Taiwan Straits, you have navigation as well as a defense guarantee running head into the wall against a Chinese core interest, which is Taiwan is part of this thing. And so I would say the Taiwan scenario is a lot more tense, and the Philippines bases are actually useful for a positioning and deployment and force posture purpose with regard to Taiwan issues rather than South China Sea issues, frankly.
Right, so Sourabh, when you refer to the Taiwan scenario, is that a reference to the fact that if a conflict breaks out between the United States and China over Taiwan, the Philippines then becomes critical to the United States?
Filipino bases become critical, not Philippines per se. The people who will be critical will be Japan, Australia, and the United States. But Filipino bases from a rotational perspective will become very important.
Yeah, Einar Tangen, what do you make of that assessment?
Well, I don't think Australia is very important. It's far from there. I mean, there's so many bases the U.S. has around the area. I don't know what an area that's 9 hours away. I do agree that the Taiwan issue is very, very important. I don't think, the Philippines does not have a land-based presence for U.S. troops, so that's not an issue. If there was a conflict and China took over Taiwan, took back Taiwan, I should say, from their perspective, it would be very quick. It's not a situation where the U.S. would be waging some sort of protracted war, but with bases in the Philippines and trying to reinvade. That would involve a scenario which we do not want to think about in terms of nuclear. But I do agree that the Philippines is very important. It's a kind of a bellwether. It generally favors culturally the U.S. But economically, its future is going to be in ASEAN, and ASEAN is China's #1 trade partner. I would also just like to briefly say that the speech given by Xi was a game changer, and it is appealing directly to countries like ASEAN because China is saying, look, you need your own voice and you need to have your own path towards the future. This is not what the U.S. says. And despite the claims that they're not pressuring people to try to join the Quad, that was not the impression that Japan and South Korea, which are not part of ASEAN, had when Biden was putting a full court press on them.
Richard, we've been talking about Philippines' strategic importance, but China has said on many occasions that its foreign policy should be seen through the prism of trade and economic relations. And if we look at China's economic relations with, or trade relations as well with the Philippines, Beijing's Belt and Road Initiative is now part of that effort. Work is already underway in the Philippines on this multi-million-dollar bridge that China has financed and is building, $69 million there. Do you see this kind of cooperation expand as China seeks to get more influence?
Yeah, I mean, in certain sectors, actually, the Philippines is increasingly being pulled into the Chinese orbit of economic influence. So if you remember over the past few years, especially under the Trump administration, there was a almost threat against the Philippines signing up to Huawei 5G network technology. And there was a lot of, kerfuffle when the Philippine military allowed for telecommunications tower to be established by a third telecom player by the Philippines, which is using China telecom technology and investment, among others. So that created a lot of tension between the two allies, and there was a fear that security and intelligence sharing between the two allies could significantly suffer should the Philippines move forward. But here we are. I'm back in Manila, and I see that we're using 5G network, and a lot of that is Huawei, and it doesn't seem to have significantly changed the direction of Philippine-U.S. alliance. So it seems major companies in the Philippines are moving towards adopting Chinese cutting-edge technologies. Alibaba and big Chinese tech companies are getting increasingly involved in the Philippine economy in ways that I think was not anticipated just a few years ago. So I think we are moving that direction. But as far as big-ticket, state-driven infrastructure investments are concerned, that has been much more complicated. We clearly see that I mean, when President Duterte went to Beijing, the promise was what, $24 billion of investments. There were talks about a China, built railway across Mindanao, where Duterte comes from, the south of the Philippines, high-speed railway in Subic, Clark, and Manila, in the industrialist region of the country. As far as I know, none of that is moving forward, right? And there's a lot of domestic opposition to that for many reasons. Concerns over corruption, terms of agreement, environmental sustainability. But I think over time, as the Philippines and China get used to each other's terms of reference, and I think as China begins to appreciate the nuances of the Philippines' political economy, not just investment environment, then perhaps we can move more and more towards high-quality investment. And as far as counter BRI initiatives by Japan and G7 and US and all of that is concerned, I think that's a good thing in the sense that it creates healthy competition. I mean, as far as ASEAN is concerned, Japan actually matches China. If you look at new pledges of investments, you're talking about $300 billion, around $250 billion for China, $200 billion for Japan.
Yeah.
I think more competition is better, right? So I think the future could be much brighter than what we see right now, which is more promise than really investments on the ground.
James, we've just got a couple of minutes left. There was a hope with the election of President Biden that there'd be a reset in the relationship between the United States and China. But if we look at what's happened in the past 6 months, President Biden has retained much of the trade tariffs, for instance, that President Trump imposed on China. And in fact, the United States Trade Representative has said that these tariffs are not going away anytime soon. What is the goal here of the United States? Is it using trade tariffs as a strategic weapon?
I think for the time being, things are set in place that came over from the Trump administration, but I would not be surprised if all of a sudden we see, for example, very quietly, the United States beginning to consider TPP all over again. It was quite amazing in the very first months of President Trump's coming into office. We saw a number of accords being essentially withdrawn on the part of the United States, from climate change to Iran to TPP. But I think we're going to see President Biden take more and more of a proactive stance when it comes to Asia. There's no question in my mind. I've had the chance to talk with several individuals who are very close to the president, and there's no question that that Asia is going to become the new darling of the administration in trying to figure out how best to deal with China and how best to deal with the countries that surround China.
Okay, we shall have to see how it all unfolds. Thanks to all of you for being with us. And that is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.